Bismillah, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another tutorial. In today's lesson, we'll be talking about a very important concept, especially for MCQs, but also for essay questions. And it's a slightly tricky concept which requires a little bit of mathematics. And the concept is absolute advantage versus comparative advantage in specialization, right? So initially, what I'll do is I'll try to go through a few important definitions. And then we'll look at the workings of absolute and comparative advantage and figure out how do we come up with absolute and comparative advantage for countries, right? So let's actually go through the definitions first. So we know that international specialization entails that countries will focus on those goods in which they are good, in which their resources are more suited, right? That is what international specialization is, right? And always remember, international specialization leads to international trade. This is something that I'll write here, that international specialization will always lead to international trade, right? So when countries are specializing in goods in which their resources are better suited for, that means they'll obviously not be producing a lot of the other goods. So what will they do? They will basically export those goods in which obviously they've specialized and import the other goods from the other countries from the money that they've raised from their exports, right? And hence international specialization causes international trade. While if a country is self-reliant, self-reliance means a country is producing almost everything on its own. That would mean self-reliance means trade barriers or protectionism, right? So in today's lesson, we'll be actually talking about how countries specialize and then how they trade as a result of that specialization. There are two methods through which countries are able to decide in which goods should they specialize. There are two methods, right? The first method is known as absolute advantage. A country has an absolute advantage in a good in which it is more efficient in its production compared to another country, right? Which means that country is able to produce that particular good at a lower average cost compared to another country. So that first country A, is said to have an absolute advantage in the production of that particular product, right? So let's suppose we have, let's quickly go through this example, and a detailed example will be done later on. So let's suppose we have these two countries, country X and country Y, and we have two goods, food and clothing, right? This is an assumption that we will continuously take throughout the analysis of absolute and comparative advantage. We'll take two countries and then we'll obviously assume that there are only two goods, right? For now, we are assuming country X and country Y are dividing their resources equally in the production of food and clothing. So if they have 100 workers each, that means they'll assign 50 workers to the production of food and 50 workers to the production of clothing each, right? So with the 50 workers, they are able to country X is able to produce 30 food and the other 50 workers are able to produce 15 clothing. While country Y, 50 workers are able to produce 10 food, while the other 50 workers are able to produce 20 clothing, right? So in this case, we know that country X has an absolute advantage in the production of food. Why? Because with the same resources of 50 workers, country X is able to produce 30 food, while country Y is only able to produce 10 food. So that means country X will specialize in the production of food because it has an absolute advantage in the production of food. While as we analyze the production of clothing, country Y has an absolute advantage in the production of clothing because with the same resources, country Y is able to produce 20 clothing while country X is only able to produce 50 clothing. Therefore, absolute advantage in the production of clothing lies with country Y, and absolute advantage in the production of food lies with country X. Therefore, country X will specialize in the production of food, which means if half of the workers are able to produce 30 food, that means all of the workers, specialization means every resource will now be allocated to the production of food. So all the resources, if half of the resources are producing 30 food, then all of the resources will produce 60 food. Right? We are assuming constant returns to scale, same productivity of each resource. Right? So country X then is able to produce 60 food, obviously no clothing because it's now specializing in the production of food, while country Y is able to produce 40 clothing because initially half resources were producing 20. So if we double the resources, we are able to double the output because of constant returns to scale. That means the production of clothing will double to 40. Right? And then country X will export obviously country X will export the units of food, and country Y will export the units of clothing. How much? We'll discuss that later on. Right? This is what is meant by absolute advantage. This is a basic table that I've drawn. Normally a table isn't drawn like this. Normally a table is drawn in which we assume all resources are being allocated either in the production of food or in the production of clothing. In this table, we assume that only half of the resources were being allocated to food and half to clothing for both the countries. In the actual table that we'll discuss here, we will assume all resources are being allocated to the production of tea or coffee. Right? We'll discuss that later on, inshallah. Right? Now, this is what is meant by absolute advantage. Right? So country X has an absolute advantage in the production of food while country Y has an absolute advantage in the production of clothing, and they'll obviously specialize in their respective goods in which they have absolute advantage, and then they'll obviously export their goods and import the other good. Now, what about comparative advantage? What is meant by comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is basically used when the theory of absolute advantage becomes useless, or when the theory of absolute advantage cannot be used. So let's first actually see when can the theory of absolute advantage not be used. The theory of absolute advantage can sometimes fail when we assume that one country has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. In this example, we assume that country X has an absolute advantage in food while country Y has an absolute advantage in clothing. In this case, the theory of absolute advantage works. However, what if country X has had an absolute advantage in the production of food as well as, let's suppose, clothing? Instead of 15, country X was able to produce 25 clothing. In this case, now country X has an absolute advantage in the production of clothing as well as food. In this case, we cannot assume that country X will produce both the goods and country Y will only import. No, that is something that cannot happen. For that, we need another theory, and that other theory's name is comparative advantage. Now, what is comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is a country is said to have a comparative advantage when its opportunity cost of producing one good is less compared to the opportunity cost of the same good in another country. When the opportunity cost of producing that particular good is less compared to the opportunity cost of producing the same good in another country, in that case, that first country is said to have a comparative advantage in the production of that product in which its opportunity cost is less. That is how we determine comparative advantage. Right? Now, I'm going to go through this table. Let me actually erase this because I want to do this with you from the scratch. So, we've erased this, right? We are given this table, even this Oops, sorry. So let's suppose we're only given this table, right? This is a column that I've drawn separately. This will not be given in the table, right? So let's assume we've been given this table, right? We are assuming that there are only two countries in the world, country X and country Y, and we are assuming there are only two goods in the world, tea and coffee, right? The first thing to do is see which countries have absolute advantage in which good, or does the theory of absolute advantage work or not. When will it not work? When will the theory of absolute advantage not work? When one country has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. Let's see what is happening. So the values given here, so the values given here are basically interpreted as following. If country X used all its resources for the production of tea, it will produce 40 tea. And if country X uses all of its resources for coffee, it will produce 40 coffee. So remember, now we aren't saying half and half. Now we are saying all the resources of country X, if they are used in the production of tea, then they'll produce 40 tea, and if all resources are used in the production of coffee, then they'll produce 40 coffee. While if country Y uses all its resources in the production of tea, it will produce 30 tea, and if country Y uses all of its resources in the production of coffee, it will produce 10 coffee. Right? Now, that is why I've written or here. Either country X will produce 40 tea or 40 coffee with all its resources. Right? Obviously, you don't need to write this. I've just written this so that you can obviously understand what this means, what this table means. Right? Now, country X and country Y. Which country has an absolute advantage in the production of tea? Country X can produce 40 tea with all its resources, while country Y can produce 30 tea with all its resources. It's very obvious that country X has an absolute advantage in the production of tea, right? Because it can produce more with the same resources, right? Now, what about coffee? The absolute advantage in the production of coffee lies again with country X because it can produce more coffee compared to Y with the same resources. So, country X also has an absolute advantage in the production of coffee. This is where the theory of absolute advantage becomes useless, or the theory of absolute advantage fails, because one country has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. This cannot mean that that one country will specialize in the production of both goods and the other country will just import. That is not possible, right? So now we need another theory, and that is the theory of comparative advantage. Now, what is the theory of comparative advantage? The theory of comparative advantage is a country will have a comparative advantage in a good if its opportunity cost of producing that good is less than the opportunity cost of producing the same good in another country. Now, the question is, how do we determine opportunity costs of both the countries? The answer to that is we find ratios. We find ratios of both the goods for each country. That is the reason why I have drawn this separate column, right, which won't be given in the question. This is something that I have drawn separately. This is a column in which I will be determining the ratios of country X and country Y of producing one tea and one coffee, obviously. Right? Now, the trick here is, unless stated in the question, I'm sure everyone knows how to determine ratios, right? So, in ratios, we obviously we're able to, for country X, we're able to write 40 is to 40, 40 ratio 40, right? And the trick is, I want to convert, unless stated in the question, obviously, I want to convert the left side of this ratio into 1. How do I do that? How do I convert this 40 into 1? By dividing it with the same number 40. So I want to convert this left-sided ratio into 1. I want to write 1 here. 1 is to what? Right? So, when I'm converting one side of the ratio to 1, I'm converting the left side to 1, right? I'm dividing it with 40, right? This will be 1. And always remember, when I'm dividing one side of the ratio with a number, I have to divide the other side of the ratio with the same number. Coincidentally, that same number is also 40, right? So I will, not only am I dividing this side with 40, I'm also dividing this side with 40. So 40 is to 40 is now 1 is to 1, right? Don't worry, I'll tell you what this means. What does 1 is to 1 mean? Right? So again, this is the ratio of country X of 1 tea compared to coffee, right? Now, what about country Y? Again, this is 30 is to 10. I want to convert the left side to 1. How do I do that? How do I convert the left side to 1? By dividing it with 30. Again, ratio. And if I divide the left side of the ratio with 30, I need to divide the right side of the ratio with the same number, which is 30. So this will be 30 over 30 is 1, obviously, but then 10 over 30 will be 1 by 3. 1 by 3. Let's write it like this, 1 by 3, right? So, the ratio of country Y of producing 1 tea is 1 by 3 coffee, right? Now, how do we interpret these ratios, right? And then we'll obviously come to how do we determine comparative advantage, right? So, how do we interpret these ratios? It's very straightforward. Let's interpret this ratio, right? What is the opportunity cost of producing 1 tea? 1 coffee forgone, right? Let me write it here. The opportunity cost, so the opportunity cost of 1 tea is 1 coffee forgone, right? So what is the opportunity cost of 1 tea? 1 coffee forgone. Similarly, what is the opportunity cost of 1 coffee? Let's flip it. What is the opportunity cost of 1 coffee now? We don't need to see this. If we are able to figure this out, this is fine. We don't need to flip it. But let's suppose we want to flip it. That's still not an issue. The opportunity cost of 1 coffee is 1 tea forgone. Let's write this. The opportunity cost of 1 coffee is 1 tea forgone. Right? Straightforward. Right? So, the opportunity cost of country X of producing 1 tea is 1 coffee forgone. Right? This is what 1 is to 1 means. Right? What about country Y? The ratio of country Y is 1 tea is to 1 by 3 coffee. What does this mean? This means the opportunity cost of 1 tea in country Y is 1 by 3 coffee forgone. Right? The opportunity cost of 1 tea is 1 by 3 coffee forgone. Remember this. This is how we interpret these ratios. And what if we want to determine the opportunity cost of 1 coffee? Opportunity cost of 1 coffee. How do we determine that? If we want to determine the opportunity cost of 1 coffee, we need to convert this 1 by 3 into 1. How do we convert this 1 by 3 into 1? By multiplying this fraction by 3. Right? 3 cancels, we get 1. And if we've multiplied the right side of the ratio with 3, we need to multiply the left side with 3 as well. So, what will be the ratio? 3 is to 1. So, the opportunity cost of 1 coffee is 3 tea forgone. 3 tea forgone. Right? This is how we interpret these ratios. Right? So the opportunity cost in country X, let's just look at the opportunity cost of tea. The opportunity cost of country X of producing one tea is one coffee forgone, while the opportunity cost of producing one Y, the opportunity cost in country Y of producing one tea is 1/3 coffee forgone. So we can easily see that the lesser opportunity cost of producing tea is with country Y. Country Y is able to produce tea at a lesser opportunity cost compared to country X. Country Y's opportunity cost of one tea is just 1/3 coffee forgone, while country X's opportunity cost of tea is one coffee forgone, which is a slightly larger number. And since we've determined that that a country will have a comparative advantage in a good in which its opportunity cost is less, that means we have determined that country Y has a comparative advantage in the production of tea. Let's write this down. Country Y has a comparative advantage in the production of tea, in the production of tea, because its opportunity cost of producing tea is less compared to the opportunity cost of producing tea in country X. So country Y has a comparative advantage in the production of tea because its opportunity cost is less. This is what I've written here. So comparative advantage in the production of tea lies with country Y as its opportunity cost is less. What about coffee? We can look at what I've written here. So the opportunity cost of one coffee is one tea forgone in country X, but the opportunity cost of one coffee is 3 tea forgone in country Y. So that means country X has a comparative advantage in the production of coffee because its opportunity cost of producing coffee is less. It's only one tea forgone compared to country Y, which has an opportunity cost of 3 tea forgone. Right? Always remember, if you don't want to obviously calculate this ratio, right? So you have 1:1 here, which is easy, but you have 1:1/3 here, right? So obviously now, in order to determine opportunity costs, we need to convert the value into 1. Right? So if we want to determine the opportunity cost of coffee, we need to convert this value into 1. How do we do that? We multiply it by 3. And we multiply this by 3. But let's suppose if a person doesn't want to do this. Is there a shortcut? Yes, the shortcut is definitely there. The shortcut is, if one country has a comparative advantage in one good, then the other country will have a comparative advantage in the other good always. It is impossible for one country to have a comparative advantage in both the goods. It is impossible. Right? So if we've determined very easily that Y has a comparative advantage in the production of tea because its opportunity cost is less, that means automatically X will have a comparative advantage in the production of coffee because its opportunity cost will be less. You don't need to calculate this. Right? It is always the case that if one country's comparative advantage is less in one good compared to another, the other country's opportunity cost will be less in the other good. Right? So country Y has a comparative advantage in the production of tea, country X has a comparative advantage in the production of coffee, and therefore we will conclude that country X will specialize in the production of coffee while country Y will specialize in the production of tea, and then they will trade with each other. Right? Country X will export coffee, country Y will export tea, obviously. While country X obviously imports tea, country Y imports coffee. Now the next question is, how do we determine the price of trade? How do we determine how much will country X export in terms of coffee and how much will it get in terms of tea? Right? So let's suppose if country X is able to export one coffee, how much will it get in terms of tea? right? We're assuming we're talking about barter system here, not money system. So we're talking about barter system. So let's suppose if country X is able to export one coffee, how much of tea will country X import? That is the question. And the answer to that question lies in terms of trade. This is something that I will do. I thought that I would probably cover this in this class, but I feel we've already covered a loaded topic of comparative advantage in this class. Let's go through terms of trade in the next lesson, because this is also a pretty loaded topic, and then we'll talk about the trading possibility curve and then some important diagrams concerning trade and concerning absolute and comparative advantage. So this is something that we'll talk about in the next class, because I think we've done some very loaded topics here. So we've discussed how do we determine absolute advantage? We've discussed how do we determine comparative advantage? How have we taken out these ratios, and what do these ratios mean in terms of opportunity cost, and then which country has comparative advantage? Go through this lecture again if you're not able to understand. Go through my notes again if you're not able to understand. And inshallah, in the next lesson, I'll be able to complete this concept, and then obviously do maybe 2 to 3 MCQs related to absolute and comparative advantage, which will be able to give you a better idea of how to understand this. Right? So with that, we'll call it a day. Inshallah, we'll see you guys in the next lesson, inshallah.